The Spinoff Podcast Network. Skinny are helping you show how smart you are with the 1Q quiz, an all-new, super challenging and super quick daily quiz built by the Spinoff. Every Monday, Skinny are giving you the chance to prove you're smart with the Skinny Extra Credit question. Get it right, and you'll get the chance to score yourself some Skinny Extra mobile credit, so you can text, call, or even video call your group chat and gloat about how big your brain is. T's and C's apply.
The Fold is brought to you by oMedia, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Kia ora and welcome to The Fold for another week. This is me, your host, Duncan Greive. I'm about to speak to Hal Crawford, who was the head of news at Newshub and 3. He has returned to his native Australia now and has been consulting back to New Zealand, both New Zealand On Air and the Ministry of Culture and Heritage on a few different projects. The main one has been a review of the New Zealand Media Fund, which is essentially what New Zealand On Air does, essentially what the public media that we create with our tax dollars. There was a big change a few years ago at New Zealand On Air to sort of simplify what had been seen as a system that was quite complex and that essentially was very good at funding television and wasn't particularly good at funding digital or innovations more generally. 3 years in, and New Zealand On Air has commissioned a review of that. So essentially Hal's research, and it's like a 100-page document. It's very good. It's very well written. I'm going to urge you to read it multiple times during this podcast. Looked at the period 2014 to 2017 and then 2017 to 2020. And essentially, it draws some quite interesting conclusions. It's very data rich. It is built off, a lot of spreadsheets and pivot tables and all that good stuff, but it also is built off 28 interviews with various participants in the New Zealand media and broadcast scene and quotes judiciously from them throughout. Full disclosure, I am one of those interviewed for it. I think it's a fun conversation. It is unavoidably super nerdy. It's very much in the weeds of how New Zealand On Air is structured, how that's different from the way other public media is funded around the world, what are the pros and cons of that, looking at the speed of digital transition, despairing for a lack of data, but also being super interested in what data does exist. The reason why this stuff fascinates me is actually kind of why I think this remains, despite the nerdiness, worth listening to, is that as we move into this new era where we go from a tiny number of channels, newspapers, magazines, radio stations, i.e. communication venues, to essentially infinite, always-on communication in your pocket, there's a tremendous challenge to a whole bunch of things, including senses of national identity, senses of national unity, how a common culture is maintained in an era where people can so easily opt out of that kind of thing. And so getting the stuff right and considering it and making sure that people don't get missed, that communities which aren't sort of your kind of stereotypical Pākehā middle New Zealand actually get content for, by, and about them, and that other communities can see that and understand one another better as a result. These things really, really matter. And New Zealand, I think, has done reasonably well at kind of maintaining a unity of sort of agreeing on some big things over the past few years, but that's not promised to us. And certainly what we've seen happen around the world, both over the past year and over the past decade, is absolutely in our future if we continue to fray. And I don't want to put it all on New Zealand On Air to hold us together or the media, but certainly I think it's a under-recognised plank is how we sort of communicate and share our stories and with those our sort of values and conversations. But this is not so much about those big heady things. It's more about how we sort of set the rules and distribute those funds. It's hopefully a fun listen. I'll let you get into it now. This is Hal Crawford on The Fold. Just before we start, The Fold is proudly supported by Vodafone. With innovation made simple and world-class network technology, Vodafone will help maximize the potential of you and your business. To find out more, head to vodafone.co.nz. Kia ora, Hal Crawford. It's very good to see you again and be talking to you again.
Man, it's an honour to be back here again, and I enjoyed the last time so much. I'm looking forward to it.
What you're here to discuss is your review of the New Zealand Media Fund, which is amazing. Like, it's a massive document. I've read it all over the last 2 days, and tell me what it is. To start with, like, because it's I think it's quite a brave thing for an organisation to commission about itself, because it kind of contains, the possibility, in fact, almost the inevitability of a harsh light in places. Yeah,
it was. I think it's a measure of New Zealand On Air that they actually asked me to do this, and they asked me not knowing what I would produce, and also knowing that I would accept nothing less than independence in doing it. So, there must have been a few nervous moments, I imagine, for those guys. But just to explain what it is, because I think in these areas, as in many sort of areas of bureaucracy and process, there's so much assumption that people know what you're talking about, and they don't. So New Zealand On Air is the funding body that distributes about $140 million a year to people to make content, and that content has usually been TV and radio. It's been broadcasting based, and it's moved over the last 3 years. They introduced a new way of doing things called the New Zealand Media Fund, and that was all about responding to the way that audience behaviour is changing, and the digital everything. That's what the New Zealand Media Fund is a response to. But if I just say the New Zealand Media Fund, no one has any idea what you're talking about, because people in the industry know New Zealand On Air, but they don't really know the New Zealand Media Fund, and people outside the industry may not even know New Zealand On Air. But it is very significant for people in our industry.
Well, what's the, like New Zealand On Air, because you grew up in New Zealand, and if you know about New Zealand On Air, the main thing you know about it is that it has basically always been there. It's been around 30-odd years, and it's just the way we do things. But it's also globally a massive outlier.
It's an anomaly.
And I think that we sort of, as a result of the fact it's our anomaly, and it's been anomalous for a long time. Here, we sort of think of it as normal, but it's not normal.
It's not normal.
What is the way it's typically handled?
I would call it beautifully abnormal, and probably getting me to do the review was a good idea, because if you come from Australia, you have the ABC and you have SBS. I mean, if you're a slightly older Australian, the SBS is a new kid on the block, but you have the government's money, which is our money. Let's face it, it's the taxpayers' money that goes towards, in Australia, that goes towards the ABC. But in New Zealand, there's a different system, and that different system might be intuitive to you, but it certainly wasn't to me. And it's basically that a lot of that public money is distributed to commercial entities to make content for the public good, really.
So all over the world, just correct me if I'm wrong, for the most part, where there is publicly funded media, it goes to organisations, predominantly non-commercial organisations, who themselves, in a relatively top-down style, decide what they think is good for the country, is a good use of public media funding for the country, and they create their own sort of editorial and entertainment channels or sites or whatever the products are, stations. Whereas in New Zealand, we have it completely decentralized, in that mostly the private productions seem to make stuff, mostly by pitching it to either government-owned commercial or non-government-owned commercial entities. And so there's a level of dispersion to the kind of creativity and to what is made. And then ultimately they bid for that funding. New Zealand On Air decides whether it does or doesn't fund it. And there's such different systems.
you're dead right. That is very unusual. I think there might be one or two other examples in the world of similar but not identical systems. But there's payoffs and there's bonuses and bummers about this. One of the bonuses is the agility of the New Zealand system. So, as demonstrated with this New Zealand Media Fund, where they said, okay, we're going to pivot towards not worrying about what platform we're funding. It might be digital, might be TV or whatever, but we're going to look at the merits of the pictures in themselves. So that's nice, and you can be very flexible, and you can also, from one year to another, you can drop a dud production house, for example, or a dud show or whatever it is, or you can look for innovation, you can look for new things, and you get a lot of great turnover. There is a downside, and the downside is that there is less of an institutional cultural development in place. And that sounds very generic, but what I'm talking about here is in Australia, people grow up with the ABC, and you grow up watching ABC as kids, and then you sort of mature and it's always there. And over time, there's worth built within the institution of the ABC. And, that exists to some extent in RNZ, but doesn't really exist in other places. And that is one of the costs of not having a big, strong public broadcaster.
Do you think, TVNZ would argue that it accomplishes that in a more commercial setting, that sort of cultural centre of gravity. What would you say is the difference between a TVNZ and an ABC in terms of how it relates to the nation that it represents?
Well, it's interesting that somehow we've managed to get onto this, but I'll go with it. I think TVNZ to an extent does fulfil that function. And, as you know, in my past life, I was pitted against them as my mortal enemy. But that's not how I feel about them, and I hope I've got a pretty balanced view about TVNZ, and I think they achieve a lot. But they don't achieve everything that a public broadcaster would do over decades, and the truth is that TVNZ itself has been subject to great changes and rents in its fabric. It wasn't too long ago that they had a charter themselves, and then they didn't have it, they had it, then it got taken away again. And, that whole thing is subject to political, let's call them fashions. And,
it almost feels like right now they've reinstituted a sort of soft charter by stealth in a way to preempt regulation. Kind of, it's a head scratcher.
If you would you do that? Let's do an experiment, Duncan. If you were in charge of TVNZ, what would you do?
Well, absolutely I would. Like the logical thing to do is to sort of make your product amenable to what you think the government wants, lest they tell you what they want and it not be quite so well aligned with your intentions or your vision. This is a very basic thing. We've kind of gotten off topic a bit, even though I could talk about this all day.
We've meandered.
So you spent months speaking to people from the New Zealand television, just the New Zealand production sector television, just the New Zealand media sector as it relates to New Zealand on air.
Yeah.
And you've written this sort of near on 100-page report. What are the sort of things that most struck you when you'd sort of finished it and kind of sat with it a minute?
When I'd lifted my head off the desk, I got to say I really enjoyed writing this thing. It was deeply satisfying, and you can probably tell.
It comes across. It's actually very readable, which these things often aren't. Yeah. So I recommend, anyone listening kind of looks it up if you're curious.
Yeah, I'd recommend that too, because I really, for me, it was a labour of love, and it's got a lot of numbers in it, but I hope it's readable. Look, my aim. When I got the brief for New Zealand on Air, it was a big brief because it was like, hey, would you just mind reviewing this thing called the New Zealand Media Fund? And, of course I said yes, and then quickly did a bit of Googling to find out what it was. That's only a minor exaggeration. But basically, the New Zealand Media Fund is all of the operations of New Zealand On Air. So that's all of the operations of the major public media funding body in New Zealand over 3 years, and a change that was really significant for them with the introduction of this new way of operating. So it was a big brief, and I needed to find a way to break it down to sort of understand what I was trying to do. And what I did was to, pretty simply, to look at what were the stated aims of the New Zealand Media Fund when it was introduced just over 3 years ago, and then what are the core aims of New Zealand On Air. And so when you look at those things, you can create a framework for assessing, what they've done over time. So the three things that they said they were going to do were reduce complexity, be more flexible, and encourage innovation. And so that's their stated aim. So that's fine. But you also have to look at the reality as well and what people say they're doing. And New Zealand On Air are all about reflecting and developing New Zealand identity and culture. So that is what New Zealand On Air is charged with doing under the Broadcasting Act. And in the Broadcasting Act, they're actually called the Broadcasting Commission, just in case anyone goes and looks it up and can't find New Zealand On Air. Anyway, so these things, New Zealand On Air say that they are interested in diversity. Well, they are, obviously. I'm not implying they're not, but discoverability and quality. So what those things mean to you have to be teased out. But so these were all the criteria that I was going to go through and look at. And the thing I sort of love the best is to, like a lot of journalists, is to get hold of information that someone else doesn't have or hasn't had or hasn't looked at in the way that I'm going to look at it. And in this case, I got hold of data that no one else had used before, which was all of the Excel spreadsheets of the funding decisions, and not just for the past 3 years, but for the past 6 years, and even right back as far as the records would go in some cases, which is to 1989. So that was my sort of little treasure trove, which I sat on like a jealous dragon. And in fact, of course, it wasn't my work that compiled those. There was a guy called Stephen Ganaway within New Zealand On Air who had hammered that into shape and passed the spreadsheets over to me. And it was then a matter of basically slicing that data up and looking at it using pivot tables is basically the mechanism that I used. That was one main data source, and the other main data source was interviews with people in the industry and people within New Zealand On Air.
But a qual and quant.
Yeah, you've got to have both, right? You've got to have, yeah. If you're just lost in, I don't know what you feel like, but if you're just lost with a bunch of random opinions from the last person you spoke to me, that I feel very unanchored. And I really trust, like a lot of people, I love to see a table and I love to see a graph.
The Fold is brought to you by oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa, with over 4,000 out-of-home advertising sites nationwide across both street furniture and retail centres. I'm super grateful to oOh!media for enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that really leapt out was there were some really interesting graphs in it. The one of the ones that struck me was the sort of long tail that has emerged of sort of lower cost projects, which has encouraged a lot more both platforms and production houses to be involved in the New Zealand On Air system, and then contrast that, which implies a sort of a great flowering of opportunity, but then you contrast that with that amazing, I don't know what it's called, the thing that basically it's almost like a land map of every funded platform, with TVNZ just taking over half of the space. So they're called
tree maps, by the way.
Tree maps, yeah. That tree map, those two things kind of tell you an amazing story. If you only could see two elements of this review, they'll tell you a lot about what has and hasn't changed over the last 3 and 6 years. One of the founding principles, and correct me if I'm mischaracterizing it, of the Media Fund when it was introduced in 2017 was to be platform agnostic.
Yes,
which is to say
correct.
that the previous system of rounds that were dedicated towards particular mediums would be replaced by one where this isn't entirely true, but it's sort of true enough that anyone could apply for anything at any time. Now, were sort of specialised RFPs and rounds, and there were still sort of some big buckets, but there was a lot more kind of comfort or implied comfort with the idea that as a digital platform, you should have felt emboldened by that.
The divisions that exist now revolve around content types and topics rather than platforms. So that I think, to some extent, when you look at it now, you do see a lot of divisions, but they remain true to the fact that if you are contesting for general factual funds, for example, you will be up against, if you're a digital player, you will be up against the TV guys at the same time, and that remains true.
And I think that just as a sort of an observer of it, that actually feels right, because you should be judging, or it feels intuitively like a good system, and that you're judging these things on merit based on the idea and your confidence in their ability to execute the idea and then acquire an audience, and what is the power and scale and relative difficulty to reach of that audience, and so on. The line which leapt out at me was that agnosticism has not been radical, and that while this looked like a radical change, it hasn't had a particularly radical impact on where the main quantum of funding has gone. Do you want to sort of unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, and I think that this is, again, hats off to New Zealand On Air, because they had to change. The world had changed, and behaviour had changed profoundly by 2016. So this change was coming on, and yet if the change had have been radical, there would have been so much. There would have been such a massive flame war, and it would have been so noisy that it could have been really destructive to the agency and to the great work that they do. And if that sounds like I've been inside the tent too long, I make no apologies for that, because I actually think that New Zealand On Air, and the fundamental sort of finding of this report, is that New Zealand On Air are doing a very good job in a always troubled environment. That said, the talk of agnosticism it didn't go overnight from, these very strict allocations of money to different platforms to a, free-for-all, a love-in of a funding fest. It changed moderately, not even, we're not talking 50% change, we're talking, 10, 15% change.
It felt like an incrementalism.
It's incrementalism, but very wisely, I believe. And just to sort of jump ahead a bit, though, because you say that it's wise, and I on balance probably believe you, but and you sense that tension. The flame war is there in some of the excerpts that you quote from various interviews. I think of. I love that. I also love picking out the fieriest quotes, and I don't shy away from that stuff.
No, and I think that's actually a good way in some ways of just sort of moving yourself out of it and saying, well, these are the sort of industrial views. Someone like Philly DeLacy of Screen Time, producer of high budget, high spec, very high quality drama for television, expresses a view that essentially, why are we spending money on digital? The audiences aren't big enough. And I think this is nearly a direct quote. No one I know watches any of it, which
more than once I heard that paraphrase sentiment.
And
yep.
The irony of that being is that comes not long after your sort of concluding note, which points out that if you look at New Zealand On Air's own research about where habitual viewing happens versus which primary platforms are funded, it shows that essentially that we're nearing, in fact, their own research suggests that we might have passed the point of more viewing happening online or over the internet than happens through linear, whereas it's still sort of an 80-20. Now, it's not uncomplicated, but those are sort of bald facts that tend to suggest that there is a lag, and it's quite a large lag between funding and behaviour.
Yeah, there's absolutely no doubt. And if to shift this to, because you mentioned Philly's comment there, and to shift this up just to one observation in a general sense, what I found was that everyone came from where they were coming from and almost nowhere else. And that meant that I got a pretty pure view from everyone, and I really was thankful for people's candid input and what they told me. But everyone is incredibly self-interested, not just Philly, yourself and everyone that I spoke to came from, I mentioned you not to highlight you, but you were one of the interviewees, and everyone in your position diametrically opposed to Philly's, for example. And everyone comes from their experience. And, to begin with, you think, these people are all just incredibly self-interested. And then you realise, no, that's actually not true. It's because they do what they do every day and they really believe in what they do. And therefore, for someone like Philly, it is true that she thinks that the money is being wasted. And from your point of view, we also have a great quote from you where you question the amount of money being spent on premium drama to be broadcast on TV. And so they're kind of the diametrically opposed camps. And the thing about it is that Philly's wrong, because actually, peak parts have declined by 29% from 2012. So actually, the big TV set pieces are getting almost a third less audience, at least. And on the other hand, she thinks because she didn't see something or because someone else didn't something, and I don't mean to pick on her, people who believe what she believes, just because people they don't know didn't see something doesn't mean it didn't happen. And that's one of the sort of pervasive problems, is this lack of belief in something that you don't have personal experience with. Now, that
feels to me like absolutely the kind of the core foundation of this era is that everyone, rather than having like a tiny basket of media where even if you don't regularly watch it, you will watch it sometimes and you're certainly aware of it. Whereas in an era that's the lean back era, we've come into this lean forward era where everyone selects their own thing. Sometimes the things are selected by their own behavior. In fact, a lot of the time the algorithm decides based on prior inputs, and as a result, something can be massive and you can have absolutely no relationship, not just to the thing itself, but even to the platform on which it's distributed. And I think that's a really hard thing to process if you came of age. And
really hard to process. And here's my challenge to you and to the other camp, and that is, unfortunately, we can't, at the moment, with the current New Zealand On Air system, we can't prove the engagement of most of the new content. And it hasn't been tracked. And It is, the feeling of robustness and belief in the numbers and the audience engagement position of some of the material is a lot less firm than it is for the big TV things.
That's absolutely true.
Yeah.
There is no commonality of data between different organizations. There's no agreed standard. There's no one rater of it. Nielsen, honestly, I don't think Nielsen isn't even trying in the online space and isn't trying in a way that it almost looks like it exists to protect its majority, its main clients, which are by and large the TV business. But that can be true while also having a big question mark over, is this stuff actually being seen online? I think that's a totally fair way of representing it.
And for the doubters, it is very much a case of, well, some of what they believe could be true. It could be possible that we're financing things for a couple of $100,000 that aren't getting seen by very many people at all. But
there's no doubt in my mind that that's true.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the standout $200,000 hit that reaches 800,000 people is in the same bucket with the sort of thing that sinks with no trace for $200,000 and reaches a couple of hundred people.
The issue I have with that, it's also just because there is actually a perception amongst TV people. I don't want to sidetrack into this, but that because we also have that in television. There are plenty of shows that are really well funded, much better funded than digital productions, that end up getting dumped at like midday on a Sunday, get an audience that is almost whatever the latent minimum of that time slot, like midday on a Sunday is. They aren't given a lot of support, and they really don't look like the world was changed by them. And yet the dominant thesis of television is not it's a really low rating environment. It's that
totally.
It's still where the audiences are. And I think trying to, and this is a big part of what you're doing and what you suggest in New Zealand On Air needs to do is get better data. And even though you're never going to be perfectly apples with apples between digital and television, get more comfortable with trying and coming up with standards that at least roll across the different platforms. And from my understanding, based on a reading of their response, it seems like at the very least that is something that they're looking at doing.
Yeah, they are. Look, Duncan, that is so fundamental to what we're talking about here, because you and I could sit here talking about pros and cons of different platforms and, basically statements that amount to no more than gossip or idle anecdote. And frankly, I'm over that. I don't think we have any time for pure opinion in this space. I think that the question of where to put public millions of dollars has to be informed, not entirely determined, not even majorly determined, but informed by knowledge of how many and who you're speaking to with that content. It has to be. It's absolutely essential. Because without that, how do we make a judgment call? Now, you pointed out, Duncan, and in fact, you had suggested to me, and it might have even been in this very venue in our previous Fold interview, you said something like, what we need to do is look at behaviour by time on platform, and then look at funding by platform and see if there's a discrepancy between those two things. And in fact, in the conclusion of this report, I have a shot at that. And what you find is that there's a significant discrepancy. And if people have no idea what I'm talking about, just let me try to explain. People spend something like, according to New Zealand On Air's data, people
Which is disputed, we should be clear, but it's disputed by everyone almost equally, which might mean that it's relatively close to, at least we can agree on it. But carry on.
It really is not a matter of these numbers are correct. It's are they even vaguely in the right ballpark? And if they are, then there's a massive discrepancy between the way they're spending the money and the way that people are spending their time. And that's because, I'm trying to get to the conclusions here. Oh, yeah. I've got a paper copy of this in front of me, would you believe? So, spending on digital first content is 19% or 47 million, and spending on TV first content is 81% or 198 million. This is under the New Zealand Media Fund from 2017 to 2019. And
excluding RNZ and a few other kind of platform-based funding, right?
Yes, absolutely. So this is only the contestable part of the fund. Thanks for pointing that out. So this is only the contestable part of the fund, and it doesn't include music. Then you look at how many minutes a day people are spending on these things, and as close as I could get using my sort of aggregation techniques, people are spending 91.5 minutes a day on digital video consumption, and 121 on free-to-air and all of the other more broadcasty legacy sort of platforms. So that's 57% to 43%. So in short, you've got a discrepancy where people are the money being spent is about 19 to 20% on digital first, whereas people are spending over 40% of their time on watching that kind of video. So I mean, if you care about the sums that I've done there, you should go to the conclusion section of the review and check it. And there will be people who have all sorts of objections, but you need to read that section and understand it before you come back to me and say and get all mad, because there is no doubt that there is a discrepancy. But there's a really important but here. There's nothing to say that we think that we should allocate funding according to the minutes of time spent with a medium. It's just, you just have to know. You just have to know that there's a discrepancy. And this indicates to me that we're not nearly done. We're not nearly done with the way that the funding is being distributed at the moment. And as you say, Duncan, quite rightly, I think there's a lag. There's a lag between behaviour change and funding change. And that's okay, but you have to remain aware of it.
The thing that sort of strikes me about that is, because I think it's actually not even necessarily a bad thing that there's a lag. I think it would be actively dangerous if it were reversed and New Zealand On Air were sort of leading ahead of the audience. But I would say that the lag appears, based on those sums, to probably be excessive. And the thing that's interesting me as a sort of a bit of an imponderable is if it were like a perfect mirror, you would expect that to have an impact on these numbers, right? Because if there were better funded, higher quality, better marketed, better distributed, longer established online properties, you'd think that would have the effect of pulling more people across into that space or having them spend more time there. And conversely, were there less high quality, long running properties on the linear television platforms, that people might leave those faster, particularly when there was a better opposition. So that's sort of one of the impacts of the lag that is kind of hard to consider. The other thing, and this is where I think it gets really important for TV, for New Zealand On Air, and it hasn't, I've talked about it on the fold before, so forgive me, if you look at the demographics of the people who are in those places, they are by and large the people who lack for, who are considered hard to reach, and certainly, they tend to be younger, they tend to be more sort of ethnically diverse, i.e. there is a particular audience that is reasonably well served by the sort of linear and traditional broadcast parties, and then there is another audience. And I'm honestly not saying that the Spinoff is necessarily great at reaching it. And I think one of the almost inevitabilities of a shift online is that there are more platforms and more production houses and more complexity. And honestly, more things that miss, but law of large numbers is more things that really hit. And that's kind of what the argument I would make is that your report makes the case for continuing that push.
Yeah, and there are a number of really important things that we have to understand about this. As you said, it would have been, and as I said earlier, it would have been a real mistake, I think, to go all extreme about this. And one of the real reasons that no extremism is possible, and one of the impediments to sort of continued change is the lack of working with audience engagement data. Now, that is changing within New Zealand On Air. They have taken that recommendation on board from the review, and they're doing something about that. So that is going to be changing. The other thing is that we're not in an entirely symmetrical situation here. And what I mean by that is the old world had a certain cultural heft that comes from its monolithic nature. As you said, if everyone's watching The Bachelor, I might not watch it, but I know that it exists. And there's stuff in our culture that exists, that is around, that is in the air, because there are very few public squares. But in a world where there are 20 or 30 public squares, then you might not have any idea that The Bachelor even exists. And if you don't know that something exists, you will write it off. You will just say, it's not that I'm not a Bachelor person. It's that I don't even know that exists. That's like a person who comes up to me in the street and says hello, but I've never seen them before. So it is not entirely, things were much easier for a public funder of media, or however you want to describe it, in the past, because, you could rely on, fund something for a few $1 million, you'll get cut through. You'll have a few flops, but even your flops will be okay because you can't guarantee success, especially in creative areas. Really, the worst thing possible is to put your money into something that no one ever heard of anywhere at all. The reality of those audiences are real. We have to make a way of looking at them so that we can understand that those audiences are real. And at the moment, we don't have that.
So just to kind of finish up on this, because I want to do a quick thing on another favourite subject of ours, which is what just happened with Facebook and news in Australia. But if you were to sort of surmise your conclusions or into sort of, and it's hard because there's a certain level of remove, so you might not be able to speak on this frankly, but sort of sum up what you think would be a logical conclusion and sort of set of actions to take if the industry were able to set aside its differences and New Zealand On Air were to accept its conclusions at face value. What are the key takeaways from a to-do list out of it?
Yeah, well, there's plenty of little to-dos that, I've given them when you write these reports, you get into this weird mental state like you're a principal of a school making someone's report card. And that is a weird mental place to be. So yeah. I gave them plenty of, Duncan's got a great attitude, but he needs to work on such and such. The one thing that we haven't mentioned, and which everyone seems to be avoiding from my point of view, is a really big problem with the model, or I should say something that needs to be addressed, which is at the moment New Zealand On Air works as as an agreement between three parties. There's them that they're providing the money. They're the rich uncle. Then there's the producer, and then there's what they call the platform. And the platform, so it's an agreement between three parties. What we're finding is that it's hard to find platforms. So if you've got this funding money and you want to find ways to get to people that you're not reaching because you want to reflect and strengthen New Zealand accurately, so you're looking for platforms, right? So you've got a platform, you've got the Spinoff, but there's not many Spinoffs. And the old platforms, the Mediaworks, which is now split into Mediaworks and Discovery and TVNZ, they're great because you know that they're going to reach people. That there's a choke point around the platforms. There's not enough local New Zealand owned and operated, run. No one really cares who owns them, but it's more important about who operates them and whether they've got a local presence. There's not enough of those local New Zealand platforms in order to justify, spending more at the moment, and so that's a real problem. There's plenty of producers. New Zealand On Air is operating just as it always has, and audiences are more voracious than ever. But it's the platform that has become a tight squeeze.
That is one of the things that really leapt out, and I hadn't properly considered. Mark Jennings makes that sort of statement quite well from Newsroom, because there's this issue, right, where New Zealand On Air has baked into its sort of conception of the world that it should try and extract maximum value for public funds, and that it imagines that the way you do that is to have the biggest possible contribution in cash or kind from the platform to the production, which I've long argued is shouldn't be the goal. The goal should be to get as many eyes on as much important New Zealand content as possible, and then test the sort of the funding side later, rather than try and have the maximum possible investment. I think that's a small but actually quite significant change in incentive structure. The thing that strikes me is that the people most disadvantaged by the sort of the relative paucity of platforms are the very audiences which are contained in that diversity piece, like the Rotaki Māori audiences, Pacifica audiences, Asian New Zealanders, any kind of person that is not your sort of meat and two veg Pākehā New Zealander in their 40s or 50s tend to get squeezed out because the biggest single demographic block audience is the one that gets most stuff made for them, and therefore gets the prime time slots on the biggest platforms. And then the fact that there's a sort of an absence of that, and fundamentally the financial incentives around the commissioning of, and then the incentives to really push the distribution side to reach on a necessarily smaller but actually relatively speaking, more important audience from a New Zealand On Air perspective, particularly in terms of trying to fulfil their charter in a meaningful way. The incentive structures sort of still feel wrong there. Like it ends up being perceived as a lift, and they treat it in the same way, in that they still want the contribution, even though the actual ability to monetize that thing, to make, i.e. to pay for the contribution, just sort of isn't there. And there's sort of an interesting kind of question you pose or idea that comes out of it, that should all this stuff ultimately drain to a massive online library where it's sort of freely and publicly accessible, after, say, pick a date, 3 years after first airing or broadcast or release, and there are there's lots of kind of cool things you could do with that, like including allowing platforms to sort of schedule or distribute that stuff in their own way, which might and on a revenue share basis. There's a whole lot of stuff you could do there to essentially make the $2.5 billion that has been spent on this stuff more accessible.
Yeah. I think
inaccessible to the public.
Yeah, the historical reasons for the insistence on contribution from platforms, it makes perfect sense. And increasingly in a new world, it makes less sense, and there are different types of environments where it might still make sense. But I agree that it makes less sense in a world where there is less certainty over who controls access to the audience. In general, Duncan, I would say that there is an opportunity for New Zealand On Air. The fact that broadcasters used to bring a significant sum to these productions always necessarily gave them more influence over outcomes in the discussions and then the contractual arrangements. However, one of the realities was the vast majority came from the public purse. Now, it's my view, just as a philosophical position, that you can put a lot more requirements on these funding arrangements than potentially is currently happening. And one of those could be that the content is freely available after 3 years. Look, I don't know. It seems to me that if something has been majority funded by the public, then the return of that content into the public domain after it has been mostly commercially exhausted rather than completely makes a lot of sense and really is only fair. So I guess my point of view is that the basis under which New Zealand On Air deals with the production community can change, but again, I wouldn't do that quickly, because it would be bad to become politically disenfranchised, and there's a risk there because there's a lot of influential people that are being dealt with, and there's a lot of expectations, there's a lot of livelihoods, and there's a lot of industry based around this system. But just in general, I think New Zealand On Air probably have, I don't want to put this in a coarse way, but they are more powerful and influential than is reflected in the way they operate.
I think that's probably accurate. And to be honest, we're out of time. So Facebook and the Australian news media will have to wait for another day. But I strongly urge you to read this report. It's very well written, and it kind of makes you think critically about what it is we're trying to achieve here and how you navigate this fascinating, maddening traverse that we're on between the old lean-back model of a tiny volume of platforms that everyone consumed to infinite culture all the time, and everyone setting their own agenda. And that is a tremendously complex job for New Zealand On Air and for all of us involved in the media and production sectors. So I recommend it. Hell of a job, Hal, and always great to talk.
Thanks, mate. It was really great to talk. And it's sort of, I've been actually doing other work for New Zealand On Air and the Ministry for Culture and Heritage recently. And so for me, even though I only finished this a couple of months ago, it was like, wow, I really enjoyed reading my own work. It's bizarre for me to say that, but it is. I want people to go out and read it, because it's just wow. I didn't understand it was really anything like it is until I authored this report.
The more you look, the more you see.
Yeah.
Thanks, Hal. Have a good one, and I'm sure we'll talk again before long. That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Kia ora e te iwi, Te Aihe Butler here, podcast manager at The Spinoff. If you enjoy listening to our podcasts, consider supporting our mahi by signing up to become a Spinoff member at thespinoff.co.nz/donate. The Spinoff Podcast Network.